The flight and the first signs of fear. Flight 347 was supposed to be an ordinary trip. From the moment the aircraft took off from the bustling terminal, passengers settled in, looking forward to the smooth, uneventful ride to Denver. The cabin was calm, the seatbelt sign had been switched off, and the flight attendants moved through the aisles, offering drinks and snacks. Most of the passengers were absorbed in their own worlds, reading books, scrolling through their phones, or staring out the windows, marveling at the ever-distant clouds beneath them. But on this flight, not everything was as serene as it appeared on the surface. For 6-year-old Serafina Small, the flight was an entirely different experience. She sat beside her mother, Amani, her small frame barely filling the seat next to the window. Her face, framed by 2 neat braids, pressed against the cold glass as she looked out at the endless blue sky. But while the vast sky was calming for most, for Serafina, it was unnerving. Her tiny fingers curled tightly around her worn teddy bear, its once bright fur now faded and frayed from years of comfort. To the outside world, the bear seemed like just another childhood possession, but to Serafina, it was her anchor, a symbol of safety in a world that sometimes felt too big, too unpredictable. But even the bear's soft, comforting presence couldn't ward off the sense of unease that had been slowly creeping into Serafina's heart since the plane had taken off. "Mommy," Serafina whispered, her voice barely audible, but filled with a tremor of anxiety. Amani looked down at her daughter, offering a soft smile. "What's wrong, baby? Aren't you excited? We're flying high in the sky." Serafina shook her head. The excitement that her mother was trying to encourage just wasn't there. Instead, her stomach churned with a sensation she couldn't explain. It was as though the very air around her had grown heavier, more oppressive, and the more she tried to focus on the view outside the window, the less she felt in control of the situation. Her gaze darted between the clouds, the horizon, and the people around her, her heart racing. "I don't like it, Mommy. It feels wrong," Serafina muttered, her voice strained with worry. Amani, ever patient and calm, reached over to stroke her daughter's hair. "Sweetheart, you're just nervous. Flying can be a little strange at first, but it's perfectly safe. Look, see that? You're up so high, like a bird. Look at how small the world below is." Serafina glanced at her mother, but her heart was not in the reassurance. There was a weight in the pit of her stomach that she could not shake. Her chest tightened with each passing minute, and she felt an urgent need to warn someone, to make sure they knew. A faint ripple of turbulence broke her concentration. The plane shuddered, a mild vibration that sent a ripple of unease through the cabin. It was nothing to worry about. It was the typical gentle movements that came with the airplane crossing through light air pockets. Yet for Serafina, even that small motion was enough to send her pulse skyrocketing. She could feel her small body tensing, her fingers now clutching her teddy bear so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She shifted in her seat, her legs dangling off the edge, her feet tapping an erratic rhythm against the carpeted floor. She glanced at her mother again, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide and glassy. "Mommy," she repeated, her voice catching in her throat. "Mommy, something's wrong. It's not safe. We have to stop." Amani gave a soft chuckle, trying to ease her daughter's anxiety. "Sweetheart, I promise you, everything is fine. We're flying safely. The pilots know what they're doing." But Serafina was not so sure. As her mother spoke, the weight in her chest intensified. The plane lurched again, slightly more pronounced this time, and her grip tightened around the teddy bear. Something was happening, a feeling in her bones, a warning signal that she could not ignore. The flight attendants, too, were moving with practiced calmness, their steps light and confident as they interacted with the passengers. But Serafina's eyes darted to them in fear, and the growing sense of dread in her chest made it impossible to remain still. She shifted again, her feet now pressing against the floor, her body trembling. "Mommy, please," she whispered, clutching her mother's arm now. "Something's coming. We have to go back. Please. Something bad is going to happen. Her voice was soft, but there was an urgency in it that made Amani pause. Her daughter had always been sensitive, yes, but never like this. This was something else. Her eyes scanned the cabin for any sign of distress, but everything appeared normal. The passengers were chatting quietly, the flight attendants were moving as usual, and the plane continued its journey over the clouds. Still, something gnawed at Amani's mind. The look in Serafina's eyes was not one of just childish fear. It was deeper, more primal, like a warning that no adult could simply dismiss. "Sweetie," Amani said gently, her tone soothing. "It's okay. Just take a deep breath. The plane is fine. The pilots are flying us safely." But Serafina didn't want to listen. Her body had already begun to react to the feeling that had consumed her. Her fingers dug into her mother's sleeve, but it was clear that nothing would calm her. Her wide, dark eyes, brimming with tears now, continued to search frantically for something. She couldn't explain it, but the fear felt so raw, so unyielding that every instinct within her screamed for action. Suddenly, there was another jolt, a stronger one this time. The seatbelts tightened as the plane lurched again, and the soft hum of the engine seemed to fade into a growing roar. The passengers around her murmured uneasily, but none reacted with the level of alarm that Serafina felt deep in her core. Her mother reached down to take Serafina's hand again, but before she could pull her close, Serafina jerked her arm away and bolted from her seat. The passengers around them were momentarily stunned, confused by the sudden movement. Amani's voice rang out in a startled whisper, "Serafina. What are you doing?" But Serafina didn't hear. She was already on her feet, her small legs pumping furiously down the narrow aisle. She ran, tears streaking down her face, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she pushed past the rows of seats. Her heart pounded in her chest, her fear overwhelming every other sense as she sped toward the front of the plane, her sole goal to reach the cockpit. Passengers watched in stunned silence as the little girl passed, her eyes wild with panic, her small hand clutching her teddy bear like a lifeline. It was impossible for them to understand what was driving her, what could have caused such a frantic, desperate flight down the aisle of an otherwise peaceful aircraft. Amani scrambled to her feet, a mix of confusion and concern written across her face as she followed after her daughter. "Serafina," she called, her voice tight with anxiety. But Serafina was already too far ahead. Her little feet pounded faster now, her heart beating in frantic time with the growing sense of urgency. She had to get to the cockpit. She had to make someone believe her. Someone had to understand. She didn't know how long she had before something terrible happened, before the plane was no longer safe, but every fiber of her being screamed at her to reach the one place where someone could help her. She reached the cockpit door. The flight attendants, who had been trailing behind her, were now rushing to catch up, but Serafina reached the door first, her small hand trembling as it grasped the cold metal handle. The pilot's dilemma. Serafina's small hand grasped the door handle with a force that was unexpected for someone so young. Her body trembled, every muscle locked in fear. Her dark eyes, wide and desperate, stared at the cockpit door as though it were a barrier between her and the unknown terror she felt approaching. The creaking of the aircraft seemed louder now, each jolt of turbulence rattling her fragile frame, making her chest tighten further. Behind her, Amani was running down the aisle, her long strides betraying the panic that had seized her. She had never seen her daughter like this, never felt her so detached from the reassuring words of her mother. Serafina had always been sensitive, yes, but never like this. This level of fear, this sense of dread, was unlike anything she had ever witnessed in her daughter. She was terrified for her little girl, but more than that, she was deeply troubled by the way Serafina seemed to know something that no one else did. "Sweetheart, stop." Amani's voice quivered as she reached her daughter, her hand extending toward Serafina, but the little girl jerked away before she could touch her. "No, Mommy. Serafina cried, her voice barely audible over the hum of the plane's engines. He has to listen. We have to stop. Her words were laced with a kind of panic that cut through the calm professionalism of the flight attendants who were now gathered near the cockpit. Serafina's grip tightened around the door handle as she turned to look at Amani. Her face was streaked with tears, and her lips trembled as though she were holding back the most desperate words she could possibly utter. Amani's heart skipped a beat. What was happening? What was so urgent? Baby, please, you're scaring me, Amani whispered, trying to soothe her, but it only seemed to intensify Serafina's fear. Just as Serafina was about to pound her small fist against the door, the cockpit door opened, and Captain Miles Carter emerged. He had been overseeing the flight from the cockpit, ensuring that everything was running smoothly, but the frantic energy in the cabin was unmistakable. He'd already noticed the subtle tremors and murmurs in the atmosphere as the turbulence increased. And now, this little girl, this tiny figure, so full of urgency, stood before him. Captain Carter? The flight attendant beside him asked, her voice calm but with a hint of concern. Is everything all right? Captain Carter looked down at Serafina, his expression shifting from confusion to concern as he noticed the intense fear in her eyes. He had seen many things in his years as a pilot, unruly passengers, emergency landings, engine troubles, but nothing had quite prepared him for this moment. There was a quiet yet unmistakable power in this child's gaze, a sense of knowing, an intuition that unsettled him. He knelt down before her, his large frame towering over her despite the gesture of kindness. Hey there, he said gently, his deep voice soothing as he tried to gauge the situation. What's going on? Why are you so upset? Serafina looked up at him with desperation. Her small voice quivered as she spoke, barely a whisper over the hum of the engines. Something's wrong. Something bad is going to happen. We have to stop. We have to go back. Captain Carter's brow furrowed. The words were fragmented, jumbled together in a rush of emotion, but they struck him in a way that no simple child's fear could. There was something about the sheer certainty in her voice that resonated with him, something about her body language, the way she stood so firmly in her fear, that made him pause. Now, Captain Carter was no stranger to the unexpected. He had spent decades in the skies, handling situations that would rattle most people to their core. But this? This was different. Something in Serafina's eyes sent a chill down his spine. Sweetheart, he said slowly, kneeling further so their eyes were level, I know it can be scary sometimes when you fly, but I promise you, the plane is fine. The pilots know exactly what we're doing. Serafina shook her head furiously, her braids bouncing as she did. No. No, you don't understand. Something's coming. Something's wrong. Her voice cracked as she clung to her teddy bear for dear life, pressing it against her chest with a force that belied her small frame. Captain Carter's heart went out to her, but the pilot in him began to rise, his instincts pushing away the emotions that clouded his judgment. He had to remain professional, especially in the face of this strange panic. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch firm yet gentle. Listen, I need you to calm down. I'm going to take care of everything, okay? The plane is going to be just fine. But Serafina wasn't listening. Her small hand shot out and gripped his uniform with surprising strength, pulling herself closer to him as though trying to pull him into her world of fear. Her tiny voice, ragged with emotion, trembled as she looked up at him. Please, pilot, please, you have to believe me. Her words struck him harder than anything else. It wasn't the frantic tears or the pleas, it was that sense of urgency in her voice, the intensity behind her words. As a seasoned pilot, he had learned to trust his gut, and something about this child's certainty felt as though it were pulling him toward a precipice, a place he wasn't sure he should go. Before he could respond, a loud thump reverberated through the cabin. The entire plane seemed to shudder under the pressure, a tremor that seemed to come from deep within the craft itself. The passengers gasped in unison, their heads jerking toward the source of the disturbance. The lights flickered momentarily, and the ever-present hum of the engines grew quieter, almost muted. Captain Carter's hand instinctively reached for the intercom, but just as quickly, the cockpit door slammed shut. The familiar sound of turbulence escalated, and the seatbelt sign flickered on. The calm, methodical hum of the flight was suddenly disrupted. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. This wasn't normal. "Stay here, sweetie," Captain Carter said to Serafina, his voice now laced with an edge of concern he hadn't intended to reveal. He glanced over at the flight attendants who were now visibly shaken. "I need to check something." The flight attendants quickly followed, but Amani's worried voice cut through the tense atmosphere. "What's happening? Why are you looking at her like that?" Captain Carter paused before answering, his voice steady but with an undeniable edge of urgency. "Something's wrong with the aircraft. I'll need to check the systems." "Stay calm, ma'am. We're going to handle this." He turned away, moving swiftly toward the cockpit. But as his footsteps echoed down the aisle, he couldn't shake the feeling that something far beyond mechanical failure was at play. Was it coincidence that the tremors and the turbulence had started just moments after Serafina's warning? Or was there something more, something that couldn't be explained by instruments, but only by instinct? Serafina's frantic plea echoed in his mind, "Something's wrong. Something bad is going to happen." Unraveling the unseen. The cockpit door swung open with a quiet whoosh, and Captain Carter stepped inside, his heart racing. The turbulence had intensified, and the plane shuddered in the air, its engines humming louder than usual. The smooth ride they had experienced moments before was now a distant memory. His eyes locked onto the instruments in front of him, the dials, the screens, the indicators. Everything seemed fine, nothing that screamed danger or malfunction, yet the unsettling feeling in the pit of his stomach grew by the second. He pressed a button on the console, connecting with the first officer. "Miles to Zach, what's our status?" "Something doesn't feel right." "All systems normal, Captain," Zach's voice crackled over the intercom, calm as ever. "Altitude steady, no warning lights, no anomalies in the engines. We're good to go." Captain Carter stared at the monitors, then glanced out the window. The sky stretched out endlessly, a cloudless expanse of blue that gave no hint of what was causing the unease in his gut. He turned back to the flight path, scanning it with increasing suspicion. It didn't make sense. What was happening? Why was he feeling so unsettled? And why had Serafina's warning sounded so vivid in his mind? Her little face, eyes wide with terror, her words insistent, demanding attention, "Something bad is going to happen." It echoed like a warning he couldn't escape. There was a shift in the air, an inexplicable tension that seemed to gather in the cockpit. The hum of the engines suddenly seemed more ominous, as though something deep within the machine was awakening. The aircraft lurched once more, this time with more force than before, enough to rattle the crew from their seats. Carter gripped the controls, his knuckles turning white. "Zach, check the back again, please. Double-check everything. It's not just the turbulence, something is off," Captain Carter said, his voice firmer now, a touch of urgency slipping through despite his best efforts to stay calm. "I'm on it, Captain. I'll check the rear sensors and see if there's any feedback we missed." The first officer's calm response did little to quell the mounting discomfort. Carter could feel it in his chest, that growing pressure, the same kind of anticipation one feels when standing at the edge of a cliff, waiting for something to push them over. His fingers hovered over the communication buttons, ready to notify the tower, but something inside held him back. He needed to be certain. Before he could make the call, the plane jolted again, harder this time. The intercom buzzed, and the voice of the flight attendants crackled through the speakers. "Captain, this is Carla in the rear cabin. We're experiencing some erratic movement back here. Passengers are starting to panic. We need your advice, what's going on?" Captain Carter's jaw tightened. He'd expected turbulence, but this wasn't normal. It wasn't just the plane. There was something else in the air, something he couldn't put his finger on. His gaze flickered back to the small screen showing the passenger cabins. A small cluster of passengers had risen from their seats, clutching their armrests, their faces a mix of confusion and unease. Then, his eyes fell on Serafina, still standing in the same spot where he'd left her, her wide-eyed gaze fixed on the cockpit door. She looked different now, her terror was sharper, more focused, like she was waiting for something. And then it hit him. The air in the cockpit grew heavier, the pressure pressing against his chest like a physical weight. There was a deep, unsettling hum now, not from the engines, but from within the fabric of the aircraft itself, a low, vibrating resonance that seemed to reverberate through the entire cabin. It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling. A sensation that made every hair on the back of his neck stand on end. A pulse of anxiety seized Captain Carter. He turned to Zack, who was hunched over the control panel, tapping away at the instruments, searching for something, anything, that could explain this disturbance. But even Zack seemed to feel it now. The unease in his posture was unmistakable. "Zack," Captain Carter said, his voice tight, "get on the radio. I want to make sure the tower is aware. We might have to make an emergency landing." The first officer's eyes widened in acknowledgement, and he immediately reached for the radio, his hands trembling slightly. "Denver Tower, this is Flight 347. We're experiencing some unusual turbulence. Can you confirm any air disturbances or sudden shifts in the atmosphere in this region?" The static buzzed for a moment before the response came. "Flight 347, Denver Tower. No major weather patterns reported in your sector. You're clear for a routine flight path. Is everything okay?" Carter glanced at Zack, his face a mirror of confusion. "You heard that, right? No disturbances. Yet this feels like more than turbulence." "Understood, Captain. We're getting some odd readings in the cockpit. We might have to adjust." Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the cabin, followed by a metallic groan. The sound seemed to come from deep within the plane, reverberating as though the very structure of the aircraft was bending, shifting. Captain Carter's heart skipped a beat. "Zack, we need to get to the bottom of this, now," Carter snapped, his calm demeanor cracking for the first time in years. Zack was already on it, tapping furiously at the screens, his face a mask of concentration. But it wasn't just the technical readings that were troubling him, it was the sense of impending doom that had begun to creep into his mind. Whatever was happening, it was more than just a mechanical issue. There was something else, something intangible, that felt wrong. Meanwhile, the passengers in the cabin were becoming more agitated. The murmurs were growing louder, the unease spreading like wildfire. The flight attendants did their best to calm the passengers, but their nervous smiles could not mask the fear creeping into their eyes. In the back of the plane, Serafina was still standing by the cockpit door, her face pale, her hands clenched tightly around her worn teddy bear. She could feel it, whatever had taken over the plane. She could feel it deep within her bones. Her little heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the cockpit, willing the captain to understand. To see what she saw. Something was coming. Something terrible. Captain Carter's breath hitched as he looked out the window once more. The skies were still clear, but in his gut, he knew the storm wasn't coming from the outside. It was coming from within. Something was happening to the very fabric of the air, something unseen, something terrifying. The hum grew louder. Then came the silence. The engine noise died, and the plane felt weightless for a split second, as though it had lost all sense of gravity. And in that terrifying moment, as if on cue, the lights flickered once more. A deep, resonant sound, almost like the beating of a massive, unseen heart, echoed throughout the cabin. It was happening. What Serafina had sensed. Something bad. Captain Carter's pulse raced as he grabbed the intercom. "All passengers, remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. We are experiencing an unexpected disturbance. Please stay calm." His voice, though steady, held an edge of urgency. But it was too late. The first explosion of fear swept through the cabin. Passengers screamed. The plane pitched downward, and for one heart-stopping moment, Captain Carter thought they might be falling out of the sky. The engine sputtered. The control panel flickered. The lights blinked once more, and then, everything went black. The silent descent. The lights flickered again, casting the cabin in an eerie half-light that only deepened the growing tension. The plane lurched as if caught in the grip of an unseen hand, shaking and rattling. Every creak, every groan of the fuselage, felt amplified in the otherwise deathly silence that had enveloped the cabin. The frantic sounds of passengers struggling to stay calm, some screaming, others muttering prayers, filled the air, but Captain Carter couldn't focus on them. His world had narrowed to the instruments in front of him, the trembling controls beneath his fingers, and the ever-present hum of the plane that now seemed to take on a darker, more sinister undertone. For a brief moment, the world outside the cockpit window was nothing but a deep, inky void, no stars, no clouds, just the suffocating darkness of a nightmare. A nightmare that was unfolding in real time. Zach, his first officer, had gone eerily quiet. The usual banter and calm professionalism were gone, replaced by the palpable fear that hung thick in the air between them. He was glued to the monitor, eyes darting over the data, desperately trying to find something, anything, that would explain this terror. "Zach," Carter's voice was hoarse, his throat tight, "what do we have? Any kind of reading? I need something concrete." Zach swallowed hard, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted the dials. I don't know, Miles. The instruments are all messed up. Some are showing normal readings, but others they're fluctuating, jumping all over the place." Carter's stomach twisted in a knot. He ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing through 1,000 different possibilities, none of which made sense. Could there have been an equipment malfunction of this magnitude? A freak electrical failure? But the plane had been inspected, it was in top condition. He couldn't fathom what could be causing this. It was as though the aircraft itself had turned against them. Meanwhile, the cabin was descending further into chaos. The shrieks of passengers were drowned out by the deafening noise of turbulence, a violent shaking that threatened to rip the plane apart. Flight attendants scrambled up and down the aisles, trying to reassure the passengers, but their faces were pale, their eyes wide with terror. Even the most seasoned crew members had never faced anything like this. Serafina, clinging to her teddy bear in her mother's lap, trembled violently. She could feel it, the oppressive weight of fear that filled the air. Her wide eyes, wet with tears, remained fixed on the cockpit door. She knew something no one else did. She knew they were running out of time. Her mother, Amani, held her tightly, whispering calming words, but even she couldn't hide the deep concern that had etched itself into her face. The little girl's warning had not been taken seriously enough. No one had understood her words, dismissed them as the wild imaginings of a child. But now, as the cabin shook like a rag doll in a storm, the truth of Serafina's fear felt undeniable. "Mommy," Serafina whispered, her voice trembling. "It's going to happen. It's coming." Amani didn't know what to say. She kissed the top of her daughter's head, trying to reassure her, but deep down, she shared the same fear. Something wasn't right. The sensation in her chest, the ache that had settled there ever since they'd boarded the plane, was growing stronger. It was the feeling of being trapped in a story where the ending was already written, and no matter what they did, they couldn't escape the fate that awaited them. The cockpit door flew open, and a flight attendant stumbled in, her face pale with fright. "Captain, something's wrong with the back of the plane. We're losing control of the cabin. We need to prepare for an emergency landing." Her words were rushed, her voice high-pitched and strained. Carter's grip tightened on the controls as he absorbed the gravity of her words. An emergency landing was no longer a precaution, it was a necessity. But where could they land? There was nothing but open sky for miles, and the nearest airport was still hundreds of miles away. And with the state of the plane, an emergency landing in such conditions would be nothing short of a miracle. Get back to your seats and make sure everyone is strapped in. Carter barked, his voice taking on an edge of authority that had been lacking moments earlier. I'm going to get us down. He turned to Zach, who was still typing furiously at the console, trying to make sense of the jumbled data. Zach, I need you to take over manual control. I'm going to check the emergency procedures and make sure we're ready for the descent. Without a word, Zach nodded, his face set in a grim expression. He reached for the manual override, his fingers brushing the controls with the practiced ease of someone who had been trained for moments like this. But as his hands gripped the yoke, the plane gave a sudden, sharp lurch, throwing both men forward in their seats. The alarms blared. Brace for impact. Carter shouted, his voice strained as he pulled the plane into a steep descent. The controls were almost unresponsive, as if the very fabric of the plane was beginning to disintegrate beneath their hands. The plane's engines screamed in protest, whining loudly, as though struggling against an unseen force. In the cabin, the chaos was unimaginable. The lights flickered again, the air grew stiflingly hot, and the sound of 1,000 hearts pounding in unison reverberated through the cabin. People were screaming, crying, and holding onto their seats with desperate, white-knuckled grips. Through it all, Serafina's voice cut through the chaos. She had risen from her seat, clutching her teddy bear tightly, her face twisted in fear as she stared straight ahead, her eyes locked onto the cockpit. She knew what was coming. Her small voice, filled with terror, called out to her mother. "Mommy! We have to stop. We can't go any further. We're going to crash." Amani's heart sank, and her eyes darted to the cockpit door. She could feel the weight of her daughter's fear, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure she could protect her from what was unfolding. Her eyes filled with tears, and she reached out to hold Serafina's hand, praying that somehow they would make it through this. As the plane hurtled towards the earth, the ground beneath them coming closer with terrifying speed, Captain Carter's mind raced. His training kicked in, but the situation was beyond anything he had ever encountered. The turbulence was growing worse, and the plane's descent was becoming increasingly difficult to control. The earth was a blur beneath them now, a patchwork of fields and roads that seemed to grow larger with each passing second. Carter's heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to regain control of the plane. But it wasn't just the mechanics of the aircraft that he was fighting against, it was something deeper, something more primal. The sensation that something was wrong, that something was coming, was overwhelming. The atmosphere around him seemed to crackle with energy, as if the very air was charged with a terrifying force that no one could comprehend. And then, in the distance, something caught his eye. A flicker of light. No, not light, fire. It was just a flicker at first, but as the seconds passed, it grew brighter, more intense. A massive plume of smoke rose into the sky, twisting and turning like some monstrous, dark creature in the distance. "Zach!" Carter shouted, his voice cracking with urgency. "There's a fire ahead. We need to get to the ground now." But as his words left his mouth, another violent shudder rocked the plane, and the lights went out once more. The engine noise ceased, leaving only the chilling sound of wind rushing through the fuselage. The plane, now in free fall, spiraled toward the earth, and in that moment, Captain Carter realized the terrifying truth: they were no longer just fighting the elements, they were fighting something much more terrifying. Something that had a will of its own.